Hi, my name's Alith, and my father kicked me out of a family party, called me useless, in front of everyone I loved. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing it wasn't just a moment of anger. It was a pattern, a life, a legacy of silence, secrets, and shame passed down like heirlooms. Why did they erase me? What were they hiding behind those family portraits and polite smiles? And what kind of truth lands in a helicopter with your name on it? I arrived 10 minutes early. The parking lot of the country club was already lined with shiny cars I didn't recognize. Probably friends of my father's business partners or distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. My palms were sweaty despite the Colorado chill. I had picked a simple, elegant dress, hoping it would be enough to blend in, not stand out. I wasn't there to make a statement. I just wanted to belong. Walking into the foyer, the air was filled with the scent of lavender and old money. I paused, scanning for a familiar face, waiting for someone to lock eyes with me and smile. Nothing. People bustled around, clinking glasses, nodding to each other in practiced familiarity, but no one even glanced in my direction. A woman in a black vest approached me with a clipboard. Name? Alith, I said, clearing my throat. Alith Grayson. She glanced down the list. You're not listed for the main seating. This way. Her tone was flat, almost mechanical. I followed her, heels clicking softly against the marble floor, and my heart sank as she stopped beside a round table by the wall. A small sign read, Reserved, Staff Only. I stared at it, thinking surely there was a mistake. This can't be right, I murmured, but she was already gone. I sat down anyway, frozen, my back to the celebration. I glanced at the welcome board at the entrance, names printed in ornate gold letters. Welcome to Grayson's 70th. My sisters' names were there, my nieces and nephews. My mother, my father, of course. Mine was nowhere. As guests flowed in, I stood up and tried to greet a few of them. Cousin Greg gave a quick smile and nodded before turning away. Aunt Margie blinked, looked past me, and walked on. Even my older sister Vera glanced at me with that familiar tight-lipped smile and moved on without a word. By the time the speeches began, I had started counting the seconds between each breath just to ground myself. Vera stood proudly at the podium. Tonight we honor the pillars of our family, she said, gesturing toward my father, then mother, then our siblings. Everyone except me. People clapped. Some wiped tears. I sat at my corner table, invisible. Then came the grandchildren, adorable, rehearsed, angelic in their matching outfits. We love you, Grandpa, they said one after another. Thanks for always being there for us and for teaching us what family means. Not one mentioned Aunt Alith. My name didn't exist here. Still, I clapped. And my hands trembled slightly, but I clapped. I even smiled. It was thin, but it was all I had left. When there was a lull in the noise, I stood and lifted my glass, voice calm but shaking. To Dad. That's when he cut me off. You? He barked a laugh. You've done nothing worth toasting. Just sit down. You're useless. Laughter. Not from everyone. Just Vera and Greg. My mother sat silent. Her eyes didn't even rise to meet mine. The clink of silverware stopped. A beat of silence stretched too long. Then murmurs picked up again and people went back to their drinks. I sat down slowly. Not because I agreed, but because my knees had gone weak. Useless. The word wrapped around me like a noose. Eventually I stood up and walked out. No coat, no goodbyes. The parking lot was quiet now, save for the faint hum of music leaking from inside. I leaned against my car door, breathing into my hands. The air was sharp. My chest hurt. I was 37 years old and had just been erased from my own family. I stood there for minutes, maybe longer, just listening to the quiet, waiting to see if anyone would follow. No one did. I thought that was it, that I'd drive home, maybe cry, maybe pack a bag, and disappear for a few days. But then I heard it. A low, steady thump, like the beating of a war drum. I looked up. and in the distance, lights flickered through the trees. The unmistakable whirl of helicopter blades began to rise, louder, closer, and it was heading straight for me. The sound didn't register at first. It was low, rhythmic, like a heartbeat from above. Still standing by my car, frozen in the moment where humiliation had left me raw and breathless, I thought maybe it was just in my head. But then the rhythm grew louder, pulsing through the quiet night like a warning bell. A helicopter. Real. Not imagined. I turned around. People were filing out of the clubhouse now, drawn by the noise. Heads tilted upward, fingers pointed, my father, flanked by Vera and a few board members I barely recognized, stepped out onto the patio with furrowed brows and half-drunk expressions. Nobody knew what was happening, and in that moment, I was just one more confused onlooker. The helicopter's landing skids hovered, then gently touched down in the middle of the country club's lawn. Wind blew napkins and cocktail dresses sideways. I shielded my face with my arm, hair whipping around me, still trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Then I saw him, tall, in a black pilot uniform, descending from the chopper with careful, purposeful steps. He carried an envelope, sealed, thick, and he was walking directly toward me. I didn't move. Couldn't. My mind scrambled to rationalize it. Maybe a wrong address, a publicity stunt, a practical joke orchestrated by Vera. The man stopped just a few feet from me. "Are you Alith Grayson?" he asked over the noise, his voice clipped and professional. I nodded, still stunned. He held the envelope out. "You need to sign for this." I glanced over his shoulder. Every set of eyes was on us. A silence had blanketed the party, so thick I could feel it pressing against my skin. Vera was gripping her champagne flute like it owed her money. My father's mouth was slightly open, confusion and irritation wrestling across his face. I took the envelope and signed the form on the clipboard he offered. My fingers trembled. Once done, the pilot gave a sharp nod, turned, and walked back to the helicopter. He didn't say another word. Within seconds, the chopper lifted off, blades slicing through the night sky as swiftly as it had come. I looked down at the envelope, my name handwritten in bold black ink across the front. No return address. I broke the seal. Inside were several pages, legal documents, notarized, formal. My eyes caught phrases like irrevocable trust, controlling interest, executive rights, and then my name again, linked to a land trust, stock holdings, and a controlling vote in Grayson Timber Holdings, all dated 2 weeks ago, signed by Harold Brent, our longtime family attorney, and countersigned by someone else I hadn't seen in years, my grandmother's former accountant. I felt my knees bend slightly, catching myself against the side of the car. For a moment, the air felt thin. My family had spent years convincing me I had no place in the business, that I was irrelevant, that my choices were disappointments. And now, suddenly, I had power, written, sealed, notarized power. In the corner of one document, there was a handwritten note. For the youngest, just as she said. And I remembered. I was 17, sitting with my grandmother on the porch as she knit quietly. She'd smiled and said, "The oldest might talk the loudest, but the youngest always sees the truth. One day, there'll be something waiting for you. You'll know when it arrives." I thought she was just being sweet. Now I wasn't so sure. As I lowered the pages back into the envelope, I became aware of movement around me. Cousin Greg was suddenly beside me, smiling too much, too fast. "Hey, Alith, that was something, huh? We should catch up soon." Behind him, Aunt Margie hovered like a ghost, her eyes too round, voice too soft. "Oh, sweetie, it's been ages. We should do lunch sometime this week. What do you say?" I didn't answer. Not out of rudeness, but because I didn't believe a single word of it. These people had never looked twice at me unless it was to dismiss me, mock me, or pretend I didn't exist. My father hadn't moved, but his stare had changed, no longer dismissive. Now it was wary. Vera's smile had flattened into a line. Her face frozen, hands still wrapped around the champagne glass, which now trembled visibly. They knew. and they didn't know what to do with it. I could have made a scene right then, could have waved the documents in the air, made a speech, demanded respect, but I didn't. Not because I was afraid, but because they weren't worth that kind of performance. I slid the envelope into my bag and turned toward the path. As I stepped away, the crowd parted, not out of respect, but confusion, maybe fear. I had only taken a few steps when I heard it. "Aelith," my father's voice. Not barked, not authoritative. It hung there, uncertain, almost unfamiliar. I didn't turn around. Instead, I walked toward where the helicopter had landed. It was gone now, but I knew what it had brought, and what it had taken with it. As I reached the stairs back up to the club's entrance, I paused. For the first time in my life, every single one of them was watching me. The town looked exactly the same from above. Tiny rooftops dusted in snow, winding roads cutting through pine-covered hills, and the familiar high school football field that seemed, from this height, like a toy version of the one where I used to sit alone during pep rallies. The helicopter's vibration hummed beneath my seat, steady and detached, unlike the mess of memories rushing back in my head. I stared out the window, eyes locked on the horizon but not seeing it. Instead, I saw the dim living room light on my 12th birthday. Everyone had forgotten. No balloons, no cake. Just the sound of my father yelling at the TV and Mom folding laundry like it was any other Tuesday. I had waited until nearly 10 p.m. before quietly walking to the fridge, pulling out a single yogurt cup and whispering, "Happy birthday" to me, as I ate it standing up. That was the first time I felt truly erased. The silence in the helicopter mirrored the silence I'd known growing up. The pilot didn't speak, and I was grateful. I wasn't ready for human voices. I needed the space to process what had just happened and what, it seemed, had always been happening. A memory hit me so hard I physically flinched. I was 19, digging through an old drawer in Dad's office looking for tax documents. Instead, I found a photo, our whole family, posed in front of the cabin upstate, smiling faces, coordinated outfits. But in the center, where I should have been, was a jagged, deliberate cutout. The paper had been sliced clean through. My image, physically removed, not faded, not accidentally damaged, cut. I had stared at that photo for 10 minutes, not crying, not shaking, just trying to wrap my mind around the kind of hate it took to remove someone from a memory like that. I never told anyone, didn't ask. I was too afraid of the answer. I shifted in my seat, pressing my forehead against the cold glass, hoping it might numb the heat rising in my chest. I thought that moment had been buried. But tonight had unearthed it. Tonight had unearthed everything. Another image crashed forward. Christmas Eve, the year I turned 24. We were at the long table, every seat filled, laughter echoing. They were discussing a business expansion, something about new properties in Aspen. I spoke up, suggested an idea. My father cut me off mid-sentence, saying, "You're not part of this conversation, Aelith." And when I looked at my mother, my last hope, she looked down at her plate, fork in hand, not a word. That was the moment I stopped trying. Now, as the chopper cut across the sky toward Boulder, I wondered why these memories were flooding back all at once. Maybe it was the envelope still clutched in my lap, a physical reminder that their version of me was never the truth. Or maybe it was the way their faces had twisted when the documents landed in my hands. Not shocked because I'd been given power, but because they'd spent years convincing me I had none. The shame I had carried, it was never mine, it was theirs, handed to me like a rotten inheritance. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply through my nose, grounding myself in the rhythm of the blades overhead. Somewhere along the way, I had started to believe them, to internalize their silence, their cruelty. But something inside me was shifting. The pain was still there, yes, but now it burned with clarity, not confusion. I wasn't the broken one. I had just been cast as invisible by people who needed someone to ignore. "We'll be landing shortly," the pilot called back, breaking my reverie. I nodded without answering, brushing my thumb over the edge of the envelope. The words inside were changing everything. I was headed to a private legal office just outside Boulder. According to the small note clipped to the front page, I had been requested to appear, alone. The descent was smooth. I watched the ground rise to meet us, an elegant building nestled behind tall evergreens, warm yellow lights glowing in the dusk. It didn't feel like paperwork. It felt like the beginning of something I hadn't let myself imagine before. I sat up straighter, tightening the coat around me. My fingers still trembled, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was readiness. After years of being treated like I didn't exist, someone, somewhere, had made sure I would. I thought I had seen the worst of them, until I saw what they did with my name. The legal office wasn't flashy, but it exuded a quiet authority. Oak trim, soft lighting, and the kind of silence that demanded respect. A woman in her 50s met me at the reception, introduced herself as Diane Caldwell, my grandmother's personal estate attorney, and led me into a private conference room. There, a thick manila file waited on the table. Diane offered coffee. I declined. I wanted to get to the truth. She opened the file like she was peeling back the layers of something sacred. "These," she said, tapping the first page, "are your controlling shares in Moreland Freight, 42% voting rights. Transferred 2 months before your grandmother passed. Here are the property deeds. 2 in Colorado Springs, 1 outside Santa Fe. And this," she added, handing me a yellowing envelope, "was written by her, in her own hand, for your eyes only." My throat tightened. I unfolded the letter with trembling fingers. It was short, direct, and heartbreakingly tender. "My dearest Alith, by the time you read this, I won't be here to explain, but I never stopped seeing you. I had to put things in legal ink because love wasn't enough to protect you from them. What they feared in you was never weakness, it was truth. All my love, Gran." I sat back in the chair, holding the letter like it might disintegrate in my hands. She had seen me when no one else did. The assets, the shares, the power, these weren't gifts. They were validation, a correction, proof that I hadn't been invisible to everyone. The years of feeling small, overlooked, unwanted, they weren't my shame. They were the result of something deliberate. I thought about every slight, every dinner skipped, every forgotten invitation. Gran hadn't been silent out of complicity. She had been planning. I walked out of that meeting taller than I had entered. The cold afternoon air slapped my cheeks, but it couldn't numb the resolve beginning to rise inside me. I sat in my rental car, still parked under bare-limbed trees, and opened my email app. New draft. Subject line, "Let's talk, before others do." I typed slowly, deliberately. "Hi, Vera. I wanted to let you know I've received legal documents concerning Gran's estate. It includes some information that affects all of us. Before I say anything publicly, I'd like to offer you both a chance to speak freely. We can meet on neutral ground. I'm open to a calm conversation." I paused, reread it twice, no threats, no accusations, just a simple opportunity, a window, small and quickly closing. I hit send, then I waited. The reply came later that night, just after 10 p.m. Vera's email was as polished as her speeches, emotionally vacant, professionally phrased. "Alith, let's not air family matters outside the family. The documents are confusing. Let us sort things privately before involving others. I'm sure this can all be clarified." No signature, no warmth, just a door gently shutting without a sound. My father didn't respond at all. I stared at the screen, unmoved. If that was their version of outreach, they still thought I'd play by the rules of silence, still thought I'd lower my head and wait my turn, but those days were done. The next morning, I called Diane again. My voice didn't shake. "I'd like to authorize a full audit," I said. "All votes, asset transfers, contracts signed in the last 5 years. If they moved something under my name, I want it documented." She hesitated only briefly before saying, "Understood. I'll get the wheels turning." After the call, I sat by the window of my hotel room, sipping black coffee and watching the sun stretch over Boulder's rooftops. I thought about Gran, about her handwriting, her voice, the soft way she'd squeeze my hand when no one else was looking. She had known who I was before I ever had the courage to admit it to myself. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about power. It was about dignity, about truth. And no one, especially not those who had spent years pretending I didn't exist, was going to rob me of it again. If they thought ignoring me would make me back down, they still didn't understand who I had become. I spent the next morning in Diane Caldwell's office, sunlight pooling on her oak desk while legal documents spread between us like puzzle pieces finally fitting together. My voice didn't waver when I asked her to confirm, again, that I had the legal right to attend the company's quarterly board meeting. "You are, by record and law, a voting shareholder with authority to be present," she said, sliding over the final sheet of paper. "They can't legally exclude you." That was all I needed. By 9:50 a.m., I was outside the Moreland Freight headquarters in my grandmother's navy wool coat, the one she'd worn to winter church services. The wind tugged at my hem, but I didn't flinch. I climbed the front steps slowly, deliberately, and entered the lobby like I had every right to be there, because this time, I did. The receptionist didn't recognize me. That was fine. I gave my name and watched her eyes dart to her screen, widening slightly. "They're already in session," she whispered. "But I know," I replied. "Let them be surprised." The elevator ride was silent but heavy with anticipation. I could already picture the looks on their faces, their smug comfort being peeled away like wallpaper. I opened the boardroom door exactly 10 minutes into the meeting. Every head turned. Vera's mouth froze mid-sentence. Her hand, mid-gesture, dropped slowly as her gaze locked on mine. Our father blinked like he'd seen a ghost. Even the CFO, always the smug neutral, pushed his glasses up as if trying to refocus on reality. I stepped inside without a word, heels tapping on the polished floor. Calm, measured. I walked to the end of the table, pulled out a chair, and placed a file in front of me. I didn't sit. "Good morning," I said. "I believe this seat belongs to me." No one moved. "I'm not here to be acknowledged. I'm here to take part." Vera recovered first. Her voice was too smooth, too quick. "Alith, this is a closed—" "It's not," I cut in, opening my file. "As of last quarter, I hold 42% voting rights in this company. That makes me the second largest shareholder in the room, after our late grandmother." Silence. I handed copies of my documents to the secretary without being asked. "Let's proceed, shall we?" They tried to carry on. I let them. For about 15 minutes. Then I pulled out the second folder. I took the liberty, I began, of reviewing the past 5 years of voting records and expenditure reports. Imagine my surprise when I found multiple vote tallies that don't reflect my stake, and expense authorizations, large ones, signed off with no board consensus. I flipped a page and turned it toward the CFO. "Can you explain this $480,000 consulting fee signed under Vera's authority but deposited into a private account in Austin?" He choked on his own breath. Vera leaned forward. "You're misunderstanding. I'm quoting line items," I snapped, the steel in my tone finally showing. "And if I'm wrong, I'm sure you'll have no issue providing the original vendor contracts." My father looked ashen. His hand gripped the edge of the table, whitening his knuckles. I hadn't raised my voice. I didn't need to. The weight of truth didn't require volume, just clarity. "I'm not accusing anyone," I said, eyes sweeping the table. "But I am demanding transparency, starting today." I let the silence build. No one filled it. Not this time. Then I closed the folder, stood slowly, and gathered my things. "You have 1 week to review these findings," I said. "After that, I go public. Choose carefully." I didn't wait for a reply. I walked out of the room the same way I entered, deliberate, measured, unshaken. In the hallway, the door clicked shut behind me. No shouting, no scrambling, just silence. But I knew it wouldn't last. I knew the storm I'd just released would come back louder. The first call came just after sunrise, while I was still cradling a mug of tea in both hands. Rachel, an old friend from my college days, spoke in a cautious tone that made my spine stiffen before she even said the words. "Alith, are you okay? The kind of "are you okay" that comes loaded, not with concern but with warning. I asked her what she meant, and then she hesitated, like she didn't want to be the messenger. It's been posted everywhere. Some article claiming you had a breakdown after your grandmother's will. They're saying you tried to manipulate the trust, that you're not well. I'm so sorry. I thought you should know before more people saw it. I didn't speak for several seconds. My hands trembled around the ceramic, but I forced myself to set the cup down gently, without a sound. Where did you see it? I finally asked. Local paper picked it up, some online blogs too. One of them quoted a family insider. They even mentioned your time in counseling after that car accident years ago. Only 2 people knew about that in detail, Vera and my father. It didn't take a detective to trace the knife back to the hand that threw it. By noon, the fallout had begun. Emails from colleagues at my consulting firm grew oddly formal. A lunch with a potential client was suddenly postponed indefinitely. People who'd been calling me brave just days ago now sent radio silence. I went to a community fundraiser that evening, one I used to co-chair. Faces I'd once hugged now offered nothing but polite nods from across the room. Even when I reached for a handshake, someone turned away to adjust a tablecloth that didn't need straightening. The ache didn't hit me all at once. It settled in like fog, quiet and unwelcome. But I didn't go home and cry. I went home and got to work. The next morning, I met Diane Caldwell again. This time, there was no small talk. I handed her a printout of the article and said, "They've started playing dirty. Let's talk about what happens when I stop playing nice." She flipped through her notes, then opened a folder I hadn't seen before. "I was saving this for when you were ready," she said. Inside was a clause, deeply buried in the trust paperwork. Not just in the will, but in a separate addendum signed 2 years before my grandmother passed. "You have full authority," Diane explained, "to initiate an external forensic audit of the family business. No board vote required, no approval needed. Your grandmother made sure of it." I stared at the signature at the bottom. I knew that shaky cursive by heart. "She knew," I whispered. "She knew they'd try to tear me down." "She did," Diane replied. "And she gave you the tools to stand." I didn't call Vera. I didn't write a rebuttal to the papers. Instead, I composed a formal legal notice, short, firm, unmistakable in its intent. It authorized a third-party audit of Moreland Freight effective immediately. Before I sealed the envelope, I added a handwritten note. "If you keep rewriting history, I'll make sure the truth gets louder." Then I sent it certified, both to the company and to their homes. I didn't wait for them to reply. They had made their move. This was mine. They didn't even knock. I heard the elevator ding down the hall, and by the time I opened my door, a courier in a blazer shoved an envelope into my hands with a stiff, "You've been served," before turning on his heel and walking away like this was just Tuesday. I stood there barefoot in my doorway, my morning coffee still steaming in my other hand. The envelope was thick, formal, threatening. I didn't need to open it to know who it was from, but I did anyway, because I wasn't going to flinch. Inside, a cease and desist order claiming I'd violated corporate confidentiality. Allegedly, I'd leaked proprietary data to external auditors, information that had magically surfaced after I'd triggered the independent audit clause. They were accusing me of sabotage, of weaponizing insider access for personal revenge. I laughed out loud bitterly. The paper actually said that, personal revenge. By noon, I was locked out of the company's internal servers. Emails bounced, files vanished. My laptop froze and restarted on its own before a message flashed. "Access denied, contact system administrator." I didn't bother. I called Jacob, my lawyer, and drove straight to his office. When I got there, he already had the document pulled up on his screen. "They're trying to box you in," he said, pinching the bridge of his nose. "And it's working, temporarily." "They can't prove what doesn't exist," I said, folding my arms, trying to stay calm. He gave me a look. "They don't have to prove anything, not yet. They just have to stir up doubt, slow you down." By that afternoon, the company had released an internal memo warning of unauthorized data activity traced to my access credentials. A few board members forwarded me the email in secret, one even adding, "Sorry, I have to distance myself until this clears." That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat at the kitchen counter, watching the city lights blink out one by one. The apartment felt too quiet, like something was waiting just outside the walls. Then, at 2:14 a.m., I got an email from someone named M. Thorne. Subject line, "We need to talk. Off the record." I stared at it for a full minute before opening it. It was Miriam, my cousin. We hadn't spoken in years, not since she'd suddenly resigned from the company with a vague statement about misaligned values. Back then, I was too caught up in my own grief to ask what that really meant. Now I had a feeling I was about to find out. We met 2 nights later at a diner off the interstate, somewhere in between anonymous and forgotten. She slid into the booth across from me, hair pulled back tight, laptop bag wedged at her feet. "I wasn't sure you'd come," I said. She raised an eyebrow. "You're the first one who ever asked me why I left." Then she opened her bag and pulled out a binder. Yellowed tabs, notes scribbled in red ink, dates going back 6 years. She laid it down between us like a time bomb. "These are records I wasn't supposed to keep," she said. "But I did, because I knew someday this would all boil over and someone would finally have the guts to dig into it." There were financial statements that didn't match, project budgets that ballooned with no explanation, expense reports approved by Vera's login at 2:00 a.m. on weekends. I looked up. "You could lose everything for handing me this." "I already did," she said simply. "I lost peace. I lost self-respect." I'm not doing that again. Over the next week, we built a timeline together. Every shady transaction, every retaliatory memo, every employee complaint that had disappeared after HR follow-up. We reached out to people quietly, former staff, temp hires, the guy in facilities who'd been demoted after asking too many questions. Turns out, once someone dares to say the emperor has no clothes, a lot of people remember they've got eyes too. Miriam worked late from her garage. I worked from my couch. We passed files back and forth like war medics. Then, Friday morning, I hit send on an email to Vera. Subject: "You wanted war." I kept it short. "You started something you don't know how to finish. You underestimated the one person who had nothing left to lose and everything to uncover." I attached a packet of preliminary findings, copied to an external investigator whose inbox I'd confirmed 3 times. No threats, no hysteria, just facts. I shut my laptop and leaned back. My heart didn't race, my hands didn't shake. Not this time. They wanted to crush me quietly. But I was done staying quiet, and deep down, I knew, this time, they wouldn't just try to break me, they'd try to erase me. The morning of the meeting felt eerily quiet, like the sky itself was holding its breath. Miriam arrived early, carrying 2 thick folders and a flash drive in her coat pocket. We reviewed everything one last time: bank records, audio files, a printed email thread I'd found buried in my mother's old desktop. The weight of it all pressed down on my chest, but I didn't flinch. "We don't get to do this twice," Miriam whispered, her voice tight. "Once it starts, there's no undoing it." "I know," I said. "That's exactly why we're doing it." The estate still smelled faintly of my mother's lavender sachets. I'd chosen this place not just for familiarity, but because no one could hide behind pretense here. The living room, once a space for quiet holidays and whispered grief, had been arranged with rows of chairs like a courtroom. It was a deliberate setup, no coffee, no soft lighting, just cold truth under daylight. They started trickling in mid-morning. Aunt Colleen looked irritated, like we'd dragged her away from something important. Uncle James greeted me with a brittle smile, and Vera, she arrived in a tailored gray suit, no emotion on her face except mild annoyance. My father followed last, avoiding eye contact, keeping his coat on as if he planned to leave any minute. I stood near the mantel, arms steady at my sides. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "I won't take more time than necessary. What I have to say and show you affects not just this family, but the integrity of everything we've built together." I nodded at Miriam, who cued the first file on the screen. A spreadsheet appeared, Clean, dated, with highlighted anomalies in quarterly expenses. Several of these payments were authorized under Vera's credentials, Miriam said, her voice crisp. Some routed through shell vendors with no legitimate services. Whispers filled the room. Vera didn't even look at the screen. "Is this a joke?" she finally said, laughing dryly. "You really went digging through financials like a desperate little girl with a calculator?" "No," I replied. "I went looking for the truth you've spent years covering up." I clicked play on the audio file. Vera's voice came through clearly, sharp, condescending. "If you don't make that number disappear, I'll make sure your job does. And if I have to twist arms to get this vote, I will." Gasps echoed. Even Colleen's jaw dropped. "You recorded me?" Vera barked, rising from her seat. "That's illegal. It was forwarded by an employee you threatened," I interrupted. "One of many. There are affidavits." The room shifted, people murmuring to each other. I saw James look down at his shoes. Then my father stood up. For a moment, I thought, maybe he would break his silence and finally say something that resembled protection. But he didn't. "You've done enough, Aelith," he said, his tone cold. "Dragging our family through this circus. You think this is justice? You're doing exactly what your mother always did, getting emotional, dramatic, turning problems into battles." The words hit harder than I'd expected. "She was suffering," I said quietly, and no one believed her either. "She was unstable," he snapped. "And so are you, if you think this is the way to fix anything." I didn't respond. I just reached into my bag and took out the journal. My mother's name etched faintly across the cover. The pages were worn, some with tear stains, some with pressed wildflowers. "I found this after she died. I didn't show it to you because I knew you'd say she imagined it all." I opened it to a marked page, reading aloud. Vera twisted the vote again. "James didn't even ask questions. I feel like a ghost in this family. No one hears me. No one wants to." I let the words hang there, no dramatics, just the voice of someone who never got to speak for herself. "You buried Mom once. I won't let you bury her truth too." The silence that followed was thick and angry. Vera crossed her arms. My father turned his back. No apologies, no remorse, just the usual cold retreat. I stood taller. "As of this moment, I am formally withdrawing from the company. I am severing all personal and legal ties to Vera and Dad. I want no part in this legacy of silence and coercion." No one moved, not even Miriam. "And if you attempt to come after me again," I added, "you'll find I've prepared for that too." I walked toward the door, leaving the journal on the table like a tombstone. I didn't slam it. I didn't look back. As I walked out that door, I didn't know what I had left, but I knew exactly what I'd left behind. The silence out here wasn't comforting, not yet. It had a weight to it, like the quiet after a house fire, when all that's left are embers and walls that can't be trusted. I'd arrived at the lake house the night after the meeting, too exhausted to speak, too wrung out to cry. I left my suitcase by the door and walked straight out to the porch, where the lake shimmered under the pale light like it didn't know or care what had happened to me. Days passed, maybe 3, maybe 5. I didn't keep track. I moved slowly, like my bones remembered the shame before my mind did. I ate when I remembered. I slept when the sun disappeared. I stayed away from mirrors. What played on repeat in my head wasn't Vera's venom or even my father's bitter condemnation. It was the silence from the others, the way they'd looked down, folded their arms, chosen comfort over truth. I kept hearing his voice. "You're just like your mother, too dramatic. Too sensitive." That phrase looped through my ribs like a dull knife. By the end of the week, I forced myself to pick up the journal again. The pages crackled when I opened it. Her handwriting was steady, strong even when describing pain. They told me I was too delicate to lead, too soft to be trusted. So I learned to bleed quietly, to bend, not break. Until one day, I did both. Each word was like a note from the past, my mother writing not just about herself, but about the woman she hoped I wouldn't have to become. But here I was, every scar she'd hidden now etched onto my story too. I made tea, wrapped myself in her old cardigan, and tried to read between the lines. Not just the events, but the feeling underneath. She hadn't hated them. That was the worst part. She'd loved them through the abuse. She'd stayed. I wasn't her. Late one afternoon, I heard the crunch of gravel, mail. The delivery driver waved through the glass and pointed to the small mailbox near the gate. I took my time getting there, assuming it was bills or junk. But tucked in between envelopes was a small manila envelope. No return address. My name, handwritten in blocky letters. Inside was a photo, aged, edges curling slightly. My mother stood barefoot on a dock, her hair longer than I remembered, laughing at something just out of frame. Beside her, a man I didn't recognize had his arm slung loosely around her waist. They looked familiar, comfortable, close. There was no date, no caption, just a note, written on the back in looping script. She had a life before him. It's time you knew. I sat down hard on the porch steps, the photo shaking slightly in my hand. Before him, did that mean before Dad? My breath caught, more from confusion than panic. My mother had a life before all this. I'd never asked. And now someone else wanted me to. I placed the envelope on the kitchen table and didn't open the journal again that night. I wasn't ready. But I couldn't ignore it either. The next morning, the sky was a clean blue, the kind that makes you want to move, just to feel alive again. Miriam arrived mid-morning. She looked older somehow, like the confrontation had added a decade overnight. We didn't hug. She set a small binder on the counter and said quietly, "There's one more chapter." I didn't speak. "I didn't think you were ready," she continued, her voice hushed. "I was afraid it would break you." "So you decided for me," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. Miriam looked down. "Yes. And I was wrong." The hurt I felt wasn't just about the missing pages. It was the realization that even those who stood beside me still didn't fully trust me to carry my own weight. But something in her eyes, regret, maybe love, kept me from pushing her away. She left the binder and didn't stay for tea. I stared at it for hours. I made dinner, washed dishes, watched the sun go down behind the trees. I didn't open it. That night, I dreamed of my mother standing in the middle of the lake, barefoot and smiling. When I called her name, she turned, and in her hands was a worn envelope, one I hadn't opened yet. By morning, I'd made a decision. Not avoidance, not fear, just timing. I tucked the binder away in my suitcase. Instead of answers, I packed clothes and charged my phone. I looked again at the back of the photo, the name scribbled faintly in ink, barely legible, a place I'd never been, a man I didn't know. I booked a flight before I could talk myself out of it. I didn't need all the answers to move forward, but I couldn't let the past stay buried just because it made people comfortable. That's how the lies had lasted this long. As I locked the door behind me, duffel bag over one shoulder, I glanced once more at the photo on the counter. I didn't know who he was, but I knew he was the key to everything Mom never said. Dara. Tôi sẽ ngay lập tức viết nội dung hoàn chỉnh cho chương 10, Traces of the Forgotten, đúng theo yêu cầu về văn phong, cấu trúc và độ dài khoảng 5.500 ký tự. UTF Zixdown, Bat Do Nghe. The town sat like a memory someone had forgotten to dust off. It wasn't in any travel brochure or featured in any lifestyle magazine. The main street was little more than a crooked row of brick storefronts, their faded signs whispering of better decades. I drove in just past noon, my hands stiff on the wheel and my chest oddly quiet. The photo had led me here, my mother's arm linked through the elbow of a man named Thomas, both of them smiling in front of a diner that still stood 3 blocks away. When I knocked on his door, it didn't take long for him to answer. He was tall, even in his age, his shoulders still squared like a man who used to carry weight that never showed on paper. His face didn't break into surprise, but into something softer, recognition, resignation. "You're her daughter," he said, not asking. "Come on in." His living room smelled like cedar and pipe tobacco. There were framed photos on the wall, none of which I recognized. No wife, no children, just friends, old cars, and nature, mountains mostly. He poured tea like it was a ritual and motioned for me to sit. "Your mother, Ruthie," he said, eyes flickering, "was a remarkable woman, strong in ways that most folks don't ever understand until it's too late." I waited. My voice felt wedged somewhere beneath years of things I'd never gotten to say. He sat across from me and pulled out a box from beneath the coffee table. "I've been waiting to show you this. Didn't know if you'd ever come." Inside were letters, so many of them, folded, creased, some still with the faint trace of perfume. Photos, too. My mother, 20, maybe 25, laughing, painting, holding a guitar I never knew she played. "She used to sing to me when the power went out," Thomas smiled. "We were engaged once, early '82, but it didn't last." The way he said it made the air feel heavier. I leaned forward, careful not to breathe too loudly. "She left because she was pregnant with you, and because I was being looked at by the FBI back then, wrong people, wrong circles. I was never charged, but she didn't want that danger near her child. She made the choice, didn't even say goodbye, just a note, and gone." I didn't know if I was angry or grateful. She'd never mentioned him, not once. My father had always made it seem like I was a mistake, an inconvenience that derailed his plans. But here was a man who spoke about my mother with reverence, not resentment. "She loved you before you existed," he said gently. "I think she had your name picked out before she even met him." It wasn't until late afternoon that I asked to use the bathroom. On the shelf above the toilet, I noticed a spiral-bound notebook, plain cover, no title. I flipped it open and froze. My name was there, scribbled dozens of times, across pages. Aelith, again and again, in looping cursive, dated 1981. One page had a sketch of a crib beside a note. "If she ever comes, may she know she was always wanted." I touched the ink with my fingertips, half expecting it to smudge. The version of my mother that I'd grown up with, the quiet, resigned woman tethered to a life that didn't fit her, didn't match the woman who wrote these words. When I returned to the living room, Thomas didn't say anything, just nodded once, like he knew what I'd found. That evening, after thanking him and loading the notebook and letters into my bag, I stood by my car for a moment, staring at the empty road ahead. "She dreamed of me," I whispered. The sun was dipping low, the last gold rays sliding across the dashboard as I turned the ignition. I didn't know where I was going yet, but I knew one thing for certain, and suddenly I needed to know what else they never told me. When I stepped back into my apartment, something felt off. Not wrong, exactly, just unrecognizable, as if I were entering someone else's life. Maybe I was. The place smelled faintly of lavender and dust, and the silence greeted me like an old friend too tired to speak. The box from Thomas sat on my kitchen table, untouched since I brought it home. I had meant to open it right away, but fear, yes, real, gut-deep fear, had made me walk around it like it might explode. That evening, I poured myself a glass of water, sat down at the table, and finally lifted the lid. Letters, photos, even hospital files, each piece a breadcrumb leading back to a version of my mother I never knew. I pulled everything out, spreading them across the table, color-coded sticky notes beside me. My fingers trembled slightly as I unfolded the first envelope. Time felt strange, both frozen and rushing by as I moved from page to page. At some point, night fell. The only light in the room came from the lamp above the table, casting long shadows that danced across the walls with each shift of my hand. It wasn't until I reached the smaller envelope tucked in the side flap that everything stopped. It was addressed to someone named Abigail. The handwriting, hers, my mother's. It hadn't been mailed. The stamp was there, never postmarked. A letter to a woman I had never heard of. Yet the name sent a shiver down my back. I read the first few lines aloud under my breath. Dearest Abigail, I don't know if you'll ever read this, or if you're even still. I stopped. My eyes scanned faster. My heart pounded. The way my mother wrote. It wasn't the usual composed, poetic tone I'd come to know from her journal. It was frantic, almost panicked, full of guilt and pleading. I should have fought harder. I let them tell me you were sick. I let them take you. I pressed the letter against my chest, suddenly aware of how cold my hands had become. Abigail was her sister. Not just a sister, a twin. The world shifted underneath me, and I had to grip the edge of the table to stay grounded. Why hadn't I ever heard about her? Why would my mother keep something so enormous a secret? A second folder lay just beneath the letter, thicker than the rest. Its contents were colder too: clinical, bureaucratic, hospital files, admissions forms, evaluations, dates from decades ago, patient, Abigail Fairmont, diagnosis, delusional disorder, hysteric paranoia, recommendation, long-term care. I didn't need a medical degree to see through it. The language was generic, templated, convenient. Worse, the discharge records were missing. There were no signs she had ever left. I stayed up until 2 a.m. cross-referencing names, institutions, and old newspaper clippings I found online. A small article from 1987 in a local Pennsylvania journal described allegations against a private psychiatric facility, accusations of false diagnoses, primarily of young women from wealthy families, often labeled as unstable heirs. And there, buried in the footnotes of a lawsuit summary, was a name that stopped my breath. Abigail F. My coffee had gone cold, my eyes were dry, but I couldn't stop. My aunt didn't die of illness or suicide or any of the quiet, sanitized endings they gave to stories like hers. She was hidden, disappeared, because she didn't fit the narrative, because someone wanted her gone. And my mother, she lived her whole life with that silence stitched into her soul. I stood in the middle of my apartment, arms wrapped tightly around myself, trying to breathe through the anger that came in waves. What kind of world lets this happen to a girl? What kind of family pretends she never existed? I needed to do something. By sunrise, I had already drafted the outline for an anonymous exposé. I wasn't a journalist, but I knew someone who was, someone who owed me a favor. The names, the clinics, the timeline. I'd give it all to her. Let the truth come out where it belonged, in the open. I sat down at my desk and stared at the growing wall of sticky notes beside my monitor. Names, places, dated letters, photocopies of records I'd scanned into my laptop. A life reconstructed, not for nostalgia, but for justice. This wasn't just about my mother anymore, or even Abigail. This was about every voice that had ever been silenced and buried beneath a label they never asked for. As I closed my laptop and rubbed my temples, the last thought of the night echoed louder than any before. I thought my pain started with being left out, but now I know. I was born into silence, and someone made sure it stayed that way. Understood. I will now begin writing Chapter 12. The last name I erased was my own, based on your prompt and instructions. Please wait a moment while I generate the complete story content. The morning was still, almost too still. My apartment, once a place of retreat, felt more like a launch pad now, one I was finally ready to leave behind. I stood in front of the mirror, zipping up the black dress I'd chosen the night before. It was sleek, somber, and without any ornament, just like my mood. No makeup, no jewelry, just me and the truth I had dragged through fire to bring into the light. On the kitchen table sat a thick manila folder packed with every piece of evidence I had meticulously gathered. Faded letters, hospital intake forms, notarized statements, photos that had been hidden for decades. I ran my hand across its surface. No tears today, I whispered to myself. I folded it under my arm, grabbed my keys, and walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar as if I might never return. Downtown, a crowd had already gathered outside the Civic Center. My father's lawyer had arranged the press conference days ago, assuming I would make some gracious speech about rejoining the family, maybe even assume some board seat or another token of wealth-bound forgiveness. That was never the plan. The moment I stepped inside, cameras began flashing. I made my way to the podium slowly, every step deliberate, my heels echoing louder than the murmurs. Behind me stood a wall of polished wood and iron, ironically fitting for what was about to unfold. My father was seated in the front row, flanked by my brother Paul and two distant uncles whose hands had never once been clean. I took a deep breath, looked down at my notes, then up at the sea of eyes. "Thank you for coming," I began, voice steady. "I'm here to discuss my inheritance, but not the kind you expect." Gasps rustled through the room when I opened the folder and began projecting documents onto the screen beside me. "This," I said, pointing to a psychiatric intake form, "is my Aunt Abigail, my mother's twin sister. She was locked away in a private institution at the age of 19. This is her diagnosis. Fabricated. And this," I flipped to a faded newspaper article, "is the story the world never saw, because my family paid to bury it." Reporters were scribbling furiously, their camera shutters loud and constant. I walked them through it all, the network of bribes, the missing discharge papers, the bogus diagnosis used to erase a woman's life because she threatened the family's image. "And here," I continued, holding up a letter written by my mother to Abigail that was never sent, "is the voice that carried this pain alone for decades." I turned toward my father. "You built an empire on silence, shame, and secrets. You told me I was useless, that I didn't understand legacy, but I do, and I refuse to inherit this." The room fell into a stunned silence. I pulled out one final document, a legal declaration. "Effective immediately, I am renouncing my family name. I want nothing from this legacy, no shares, no titles, no hush money. Everything that was left to me is being donated to a fund supporting victims of forced institutionalization and family abuse. Let the fortune fix the wounds it helped create." I picked up the pen and signed, then let it fall onto the table like a gavel in a courtroom. "They gave me a name soaked in silence," I said, turning back to the crowd. "I give it back." For a moment, no one moved. Then the shouting began, not from the press, but from my father. "You ungrateful child!" he spat, rising from his seat. "You think this makes you noble? You are nothing without us." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Outside, the skies had darkened. Rain was just starting to fall as I pushed through the crowd of microphones and blinding flashes. Some called me brave, others called me crazy. But I walked on, head high, past them all. In the distance, I heard the thump of helicopter blades. Another estate, another inheritance to protect. Let them. This time, I didn't look back. Later that evening, I sat alone at a seaside cafe 2 towns away. The rain had stopped. A breeze carried the scent of salt and something sweet from a nearby bakery. I stirred my coffee slowly, the silence no longer a weight, but a comfort. I opened my journal and began to write, not about vengeance, not about the past, but about the life that waited beyond it. When I reached the signature line, I paused. Then I wrote simply, "Aelith." In the quiet aftermath of everything, I've come to understand that healing doesn't always roar. It often whispers. Sometimes, the greatest act of courage is walking away from what broke you, even if it wears your last name. I didn't set out to destroy my family's legacy, I just refused to be defined by it. If you're holding on to something toxic because it's familiar or because others tell you it's your duty, let me be the voice that says you have the right to choose yourself, always. We often hear that family is everything. But what if protecting your soul means walking away from the people who share your blood? What if silence passed down through generations is more dangerous than truth spoken aloud? I chose to speak because silence nearly buried my aunt, and it almost buried me too. Now I'd love to hear from you. Has there ever been a moment when you had to choose truth over tradition? What's a family belief you've dared to question? Share it in the comments below. Your story might help someone else find their voice. If this story touched your heart, leave a 1 in the comments or let me know where you're watching from. And if it didn't resonate with you, I'd still love to hear why. And where you found this video. Your voice matters too. If you found meaning in this journey, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. There's more to uncover, more to heal, and more to share together.